From the Aishin Broadcast Studio, it's the Amped EV Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Amped EV Podcast. My name is David, and on today's show, we are speaking with Unico's Vice President of Engineering, Don Wright. Let's get to the interview. Don, thank you so much for joining us today. We are amped to have you on the show. So can we start off just by you kind of explaining what is the current kind of battery testing process and certifications that you need out there?
Yeah, so I mean, batteries have been around for a long time. You know, we've always had batteries even in our combustion engine vehicles. Everybody knows the 12-volt battery. Mm-hmm. But of course, as the battery is becoming more and more important as the propulsion energy storage system, there's a lot of testing, a lot of validation that needs to be done. A lot of these tests haven't changed over time. So there's still like submersion tests where they put full battery packs in salt water and make sure that the external cases don't leak. Cold temperature tests, warm temperature tests. But most of the testing is really, especially the hardest testing is done by the OEMs because they want to make sure that their battery packs will survive for 8, 10, 12 years or for however long that they want that battery to have its first life. So the time it takes until it gets to about 80% of its state of health. And so those tests are very demanding. And as the battery packs, start to change and we're getting into higher voltages, higher powers, the test equipment that goes along with it needs to change as well. And so this is where we're really starting to see the transition to much more higher power systems, higher voltages. 1200 volts is kind of the norm these days for our test equipment. But we even have battery pack test systems that go up to 2000, 3000 volts for very large applications. Not something you would find in a passenger car, but more like in construction equipment.
Wow. And can you help us understand what does this hardware look like? And, is it paired with specific software that you're using?
Yeah, so the hardware is really sort of emulating the vehicle for the battery pack. So if you can imagine as you drive your electric vehicle around, you're pulling energy out when you accelerate and you're putting energy back in when you brake. We have power electronics that connect to the building grid and allows you to replicate those power draws or putting power back into the battery pack over many, many hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of times to kind of replicate the life of a battery in a vehicle. So these are big power cabinets. They look like, they're not very exciting. They're big gray boxes sometimes. And then they are, of course, like you mentioned, paired up with software. And so we provide the power electronics to many of our system integrator partners who then pair their software up to run specific tests, allows the customers to create their own test routines, create their own graphical user interfaces so that they can gather all the data from the battery management system, from our cyclers to determine how the battery is behaving. And then they then sell that to the end customers.
Wow. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And what sorts of customers is Unico typically working with?
Yeah, so we are working with both the end users, so what we call the OEMs, so the automotive companies, the eVTOL companies, the maybe farming, equipment companies, construction equipment companies. So a lot of times our equipment goes right to the end users, especially for battery testing where there's a little bit less of an infrastructure there. But we also work together with system integrators. And what a system integrator will do, we'll take our battery cycler or battery tester, pair it up with a climate chamber, put their automation system on it, maybe integrate it into the facility or a battery test center, and then have a larger overall, test and management software platform that is gathering all of that data and allowing the engineers to review all of that data to determine how the batteries are aging over their time.
Interesting. And so I'm sure that, especially when you're working with these OEMs, battery testing has got to be incredibly integral in the process of battery development. Can you help us understand what they're really looking for as far as wanting to accelerate the development of those batteries?
Yeah, so, especially in this day and age where we're hearing so much about AI and algorithms to try to accelerate battery testing, you still need to do a lot of real world testing so that you can make sure that the AI that you're trying to teach is learning the correct characteristics of those battery packs. And then, of course, you have to prove it out over time. You have to really be able to test a battery pack for 2, 3, 5 years in order to understand and validate the algorithms that you tried to use to predictively determine what that battery pack is going to do. So, we have cell test equipment, so we can, so small cells like this, or this is not so small. This is out of a Ford Mustang Mach-E, but, pouch cells, small cylindrical cells. So we have test equipment that you can do on the actual cells themselves, but we can also test the modules, or as the industry is sort of transitioning into kind of bigger sub packs where there's maybe 2 or 3 sub packs inside of a larger battery pack, we can make test equipment to test those subcomponents as well, including the conditioning systems, including the BMS, including the DC contactors, all the safety mechanisms, the isolation monitor, the things that are in the battery pack that the customer wants to test as well. We can test those all as a complete system.
Oh, fantastic. And so, I know the industry is kind of at this point where, most of the batteries out there are owned, they're in a single vehicle, and that's where they're going to be for, the majority of their life. But there's also this other strategy out there, battery swapping technology, where, you take that battery out and you swap it for a new one, and then you go on your way instead of, charging it in your garage or wherever it might be. So how important is battery testing when it comes to battery swapping? And, from your experience, are you seeing this technology kind of grow in any way?
Yeah, so battery swapping is still a very interesting topic. There's been a few companies that tried to do it and didn't succeed, but I think NIO yesterday or the day before announced that they did their 50 millionth battery swap in China. So I think it's a very interesting topic. I think there's 2 different methodologies from my understanding. There's swapping the entire battery pack out, kind of like how you would, swap out batteries in your consumer electronics that you would have and then replace them with a new one. But we also know that there's some companies out there that are having, let's say, a platform or a vehicle that has a small battery that stays with that vehicle all the time. Maybe it's 50 miles, 75 miles of range. And then only when you need to have that extra range, if you're going on a trip, do you then swap in a secondary battery, which extends that range. And I think that this is kind of a novel idea. I think it's very interesting from a personal perspective, because I think that, having a core battery that can get you around town, you can, take out the other battery pack. It's much less weight. So your energy consumption goes way down during your day-to-day driving. And then you only need the longer battery pack for when you want to go on a longer trip. But in terms of testing, of course, when those battery packs go to those swap stations, they're going to want to test the battery pack and make sure and see how the life is, going on that battery. And they might not do it every single time. Maybe every 10 times it comes back in, they run a certain test profile, and then they'll have that data that they've, have back from their lab, where they now can understand, okay, we've tested our battery packs in our lab. We've cycled them 1,000 times. We know how the batteries degrade over time. Now I test this one out in the field, and I can say, oh, this is now a 92% state of health, or now maybe it's 87%. And maybe there's going to be some business cases where it's cheaper to swap in a lower state of health battery than a high state of health battery. And maybe then customers will then be able to say, oh, okay, I'm going to pay a little bit less because I don't need that full 100% this time. And so it kind of opens up some doors to some different business cases on how to handle these battery packs that are maybe, getting older. And because, for example, if you go in and you want a fresh battery and just for sake of argument, you have a 300-mile range in your vehicle, and then you go swap in a new battery at a swap station and it's only 280. You're going to be, hey, wait a second, I'm paying for a 300. I'm missing 220 miles. Mm-hmm. So they have to be able to, adapt to that. Now, I know there's BMS strategies which sort of, let's say hide some capacity, and then they always have the full capacity available to people. Or maybe, my truck is pretty good at this, it says it's got 320, but when I drive home and I know it's 18 miles, I went 22 miles in range. So there's 4 miles that are missing. That just happens to be over time. So I think there's a lot of different methodologies, but really what they're going to do is have to test, during the life of the battery, during this, the whole life of during the swapping, but then also at the end when they're done with it, and this is really a hot topic for us at Unico. We have lots of customers that want to come to us. They are asking us for test equipment for end of life of its first life to determine, hey, can we repurpose this as a home energy storage, or should we take it to the recycle center and have it recycled?
Man, that is very, very interesting. Great business cases there, some I've never thought of before. So I'm definitely going to have to keep my eye on that.
Presented from the Aishin Broadcast Studio at Babcock's Media.
Speaking of business cases, I want to shift the conversation to hybrid for a second, because we're seeing, at least as of this moment, hybrid is really, really kind of gaining some ground here. What are your thoughts on that, and how important is the battery testing process when it comes to these hybrid vehicles as opposed to a full battery electric?
Well, so it's actually an interesting kind of shift back in the industry. I'm a proponent for electric vehicles, but I also know that there's different vehicles that suit different people, and I know that there's applications that a battery electric vehicle absolutely don't fit. And we make lots of trips here in the Midwest, and for the most part, in our battery electric vehicles, we don't have any problems. We can find charging stations. We don't even have a Tesla, although, we both drive. I drive a Ford. My wife drives a Chevy. So we both have electric vehicles that can charge up at stations, and we don't have any problems with them. But we know that if we go north in Wisconsin or northern Michigan or whatever, the charging stations just aren't there, and the infrastructure is just not there. Mm-hmm. And this is really where, if people really want to have a day-to-day driver where they can drive electric and get the emissions down, but then still want to have the occasional long trip, a hybrid is a perfect solution for this. And I think this industry is really, kind of positioned a little bit different than maybe 10 years ago when we saw some of the first hybrids. A lot of the technology that has been built up for battery electric vehicles, higher voltages allows us to have lower currents in the battery or in the complete infrastructure, higher speed electric motors, e-axles. I think there's a lot of solutions out there that were developed now for the battery electric vehicle that can be easily pivoted back to hybrid. And we're seeing some very interesting solutions out there. Just taking a normal 4-cylinder, 6-cylinder, 8-cylinder engine, putting a generator on there, you can have let's say a smaller 800-volt battery pack, so you still get the efficiency and the gains that you get from a higher voltage battery pack. The generator is generating the energy to keep that battery charged to propel an e-axle or two in the vehicles, and the engine can be running at its optimum operating point for the best fuel consumption and least amount of emissions. And so I think that there's technologies that are coming from all the advancements that we've done in the battery electric vehicles. And so it's kind of exciting to see some of these new technologies being applied back to hybrid electric vehicles. And I really think that there's a lot of people out there that would love to drive an electric vehicle. They can now with a hybrid, and they don't have that range anxiety.
I think that's a really, really good point. And then, from your perspective, obviously these hybrid vehicles have typically much smaller battery packs than, maybe a full electric vehicle. When it comes to battery testing, would you say it's more important, less important, or even on the scale as far as hybrid versus battery electric?
No, I think it's still equally important because they still want to make sure that their battery is going to live for its entire life in that vehicle. Now, that battery test profile is probably going to look a little bit different. You're going to have a substantial amount of the energy being generated from the generator, for example, to the e-axle. And so the battery is really there as kind of a buffer to absorb some energy for regenerative braking and, a buffer for when, you need to accelerate, 0 to 60 in 1 second. Mm-hmm. So I think the test profiles will be different, but really the life cycle understanding how that battery is going to age over time. Still, the cold weather performance or the hot weather performance is probably going to still be key, maybe a little less critical as it was in a battery electric vehicle where you really only had one source of energy and people were having troubles with the chargers. But I still think it's going to be important. And I think what is exciting is now technology advances that we make kind of incorporating these technologies into hybrids probably will come full circle and go back into battery electric vehicles and make them even more efficient. So I'm all for having common platforms, components across different platforms, and then really keep advancing the technology, increasing the efficiencies, increasing the energy densities, bringing costs down. These are all key components for making electrification successful.
Fantastic. And, I would love to shift one more time and pick your brain about one other topic here. Solid state versus the traditional lithium ion battery. So, I'm seeing reports all the time about solid state batteries and their advancements and how things are moving there, but I'm not seeing it practically used very often in automotive. And so I'm wondering, from someone like you who's really got their hands dirty in the field here, are you seeing much advancement in solid state technology, and kind of what would be potential benefits or even downsides of swapping the solid state for lithium ion batteries?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. There's a conference even next week in Chicago, I believe, on solid state batteries, and my wife, who's in the battery industry, is going there. And it's kind of ironic. We both share the same opinion of solid state batteries. It certainly does have a lot of promise, but it has a lot of complications in the integration phase. So a lot of the announcements that you see are really on the cell level. So they talk about energy densities and fast charging and the amount of energy that they can deliver on the cell level. But what people don't really understand or realize is that integrating those into packs and then putting them into vehicles is very complicated. Solid state cells have to have a lot of compression forces on them in order for them to work properly. They have to be very warm, like I think 60, 70, 80 degrees were the last ones that I've really investigated. And they grow and shrink during charging and discharging up to like 20%. Wow. So if you think about this, if you have a solid state battery pack in your vehicle, it has to be in some kind of mechanical mechanism that can supply extremely high compression force on the cell. It has to be warm, and you have to, to heat something up, you need energy from somewhere. So it's coming from the battery, and it has to be able to be flexible so that it grows and shrinks 20% during its charge and discharge. And I think to do that, to integrate that into the vehicle and have it live for 8 years, 10 years in harsh environments with noise and noise doesn't matter, but vibration, cold weather, warm weather, I think the integration challenge is going to prove to be too much to really see it come to mainstream in vehicles. I hope I'm wrong. I think there's some safety aspects to solid state batteries that are very promising. There's certainly a lot of promise on the performance side of things. It's just, I'm a little bit skeptical based on what I know. Even some very big proponents of solid state batteries have now come out and said, 2030 might be too soon, maybe 2035, and probably as wearables in the beginning. And so maybe there's going to be another technology that comes along and proves to be a little bit better, more efficient, or let's say even good enough, safe enough. And I think really it's going to be a tough road for some of the solid state companies to really bring them to market in a vehicle in mass. So, but like I said, I hope I'm wrong. I'm always welcome for people to come and challenge me on my opinions on solid state batteries. But until somebody does and convinces me otherwise, I think it's a long road for solid state batteries in vehicles.
And very, very interesting perspective. And, obviously the fact that there are, conferences and things of that nature that people are going, that you're right, the promise is there. It'll just be very interesting to see, over the next 5-10 years, where that technology takes us, and how far we're able to take that. So Don, thank you so much for your time here.
Well, actually, if I could fit, so, it's just like your last podcast about fuel cells. I think that there's going to be a place for it. I think, fuel cells are great, and the garbage trucks is a great example of where a fuel cell, I think, will actually work. I don't believe fuel cells are going to be great for passenger vehicles where you have to have this widespread infrastructure. It might be the same thing for solid state. There might be certain applications where solid state batteries fit perfectly, and it's a proper fit for that. Unfortunately, I think there's a lot of people out there that are trying to apply it to everything and have it be the holy grail of batteries. And I'm not sure that that's what it is. So that's my last little bit on the.
Sure. No. I certainly appreciate it. And, to your point, I mean, there are going to be different applications that need different sources of power. Electrification is not going to work for everybody. An internal combustion engine is also not going to work for everybody. So that makes total sense that, hey, let's find those applications that make sense and apply it there.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Don. Again, this has been fascinating for me, truly, and I would love to catch up with you down the road. Just really appreciate your time.
Of course, and thank you so much for the invitation. I really enjoyed the discussion. And yeah, I'm always open to talk about anything that might come up.
All right, that was a fantastic conversation. It just goes to show there are all these different processes that we don't think about, like battery testing, that are so integral to the evolution of the EV. I cannot wait to speak with Don next. I'm going to have to send him an email and throw it on my calendar immediately because that was fantastic. Thank you for joining us. Take care.